Greetings and welcome back. We are in AP Senior English, and our objective now for the hour is to introduce you to the work of Milton, and more particularly Paradise Lost. So now we are going to begin our real comments about this really famous poem. I want to begin by reiterating what I said yesterday. Milton has an identifiable project of two parts, and this is huge for your notes. One, as we said yesterday, Milton doesn't just want to write a poem. He wants to write the greatest poem of all time. How do we know that? Because he says that. He literally will say this out loud. I want to write what has never been written. He literally will say that. Now, some of you will say, that's kind of like a little bit of arrogance or conceit to say, I'm not just going to write a poem, I'm going to write a poem that's the greatest poem ever written. There's a little bit of element of potential conceit here. But there's a second project, and we need to understand this is what balances the conceit with a kind of humility, and that is this. Milton wants to answer a very difficult theological, philosophic question. So he not only wants to write a poem, I suppose it's challenging enough to say, I want to write the most famous poem of all time. You could argue that's challenging enough. But the second thing is even more compelling. He says, I want to answer the question of theodicy. Theodicy. Now, let's put that one in our notes. By the way, I didn't say the Odyssey, as in Homer's Odyssey. I rather said Theodicy. 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 Now, theo, of or related to God. We know that word from the word theology, right? That root. So we know theo has something to do with God, correct? Dike, the Greek word for, does anyone know?
I.
You're kind of close, actually. You're right, Mr. Batson. It is justice. Mr. Batson will point out, wait a minute, dike is the word that Plato uses some 17 times in the first book of Republic. Right. Remember what is...
Good one to say.
Remember our question was, what is justice, right? What is justice? So, wait a minute. Theodicy. What does this word mean? Well, I think I introduced this concept to you earlier, especially when we were talking Plato, but we'll come back to it now and we'll review it again. The way I like to present this is in the form of, it's not my invention, this is a famous way to do it, in the form of a triangle. You'll maybe recall this little paradigm, where at the top, or one of the corners, I'll put it at the top, you have an all-loving deity or deity, right? Deity or deities. At the other corner, you have what? All-powerful deity or God. Okay? Right? So you have an all-loving deity, an all-powerful deity at the other corner. What do you have at the third and final corner? What are you gonna? All-knowing will be all-powerful. All-knowing, omniscient will assume. What do I put here? To, if you will, kind of create the theodicyc project. You have an all-loving deity and all-powerful deity. Well, let's just play a game. The mother is standing next to the bed of her dying child at 5 of leukemia. The child's in tremendous pain. Someone walks into the hospital room and says, I feel terrible for your pain. And the mother says, I can't believe this is happening to my child. And the person says to the mother, well, you know that God is all-loving. And the ma says, what? But my kid is like in tremendous pain, dying from leukemia. How can you tell me God loves my child? Why doesn't God fix my child from leukemia? God must not be very powerful. Oh, no. God is all-powerful. If God wants to, God can remove the leukemia. What? So God has the power to remove the leukemia from my kid? But my kid is like dying of cancer. So obviously God is not very nice, not very loving. Oh, no. God is all-loving. Okay, dude, there is a problem here. On the one hand, you're telling me God is all-loving. On the other hand, you're telling me God is all-powerful. And on the third here, my kid's dying of cancer. Of the three things in that triangle, one of them is validated by science. And it's the fact my kid's dying of cancer. And you're here to tell me that this God I'm supposed to believe in can cure this cancer, but doesn't. But at the same time is all loving. Which leads to the obvious question, what is going on with this theodicy project? Okay? So now we've kind of explained what is Milton's ultimate goal. Milton's ultimate goal is to explain why there is evil in a world created by an all-loving, all-powerful deity. Right? If you will, to mix our metaphors, to square the triangle. How can you explain this fact? By the way, we should point out that by Milton's day, this is a knockdown argument for atheism. Knockdown argument. Of the three, as I said, of the three things on that triangle, they ain't but one of those three things that science can, without a doubt, prove, and that is what? My kid's dying of leukemia. That is a knockdown truth. The other two, you're asking me to what? What's our word? Right? Yeah, we use words like faith or believe, right? That's what you're telling me. You're telling me I'm supposed to believe in this and in this, but I know this is true. My kid's dying of leukemia. Another way to say this is, who's at fault? It's another way to say it, right? Who's at fault? That is to say, who do you blame? The kid's dying of leukemia. Do you blame a 5-year-old? Well, see, this is a difficult question. It's awfully hard to blame a 5-year-old for having leukemia and dying. It's not like the kid said, yay, give me leukemia. Right? Well, in a world that is supposedly created by a deity, the obvious question is, does the fault fall to the deity? Do you blame God? The kid obviously is dying of cancer. Who's to blame? How do you explain that there are terrible evils that happen in a world created by an all-loving and all-powerful deity or deities? Okay? Now, if you at all were raised in any kind of a religious background where a question like this was given an answer to you early on, the answer is predominantly a Miltonic answer. Milton's influence is prodigious. He will write Paradise Lost to answer this question. No kidding. That's why he writes the poem. He does such a good job of it that a lot of people will know Milton's answer and not know Milton. They don't even know Milton, but they know his answer. Like they've never heard of Paradise Lost, nor have they ever read it, but they know the answer. So for example, you can have conversations with religious people where you say, so what is going on here? And one of the things they will do is they'll go to the Garden of Eden myth or story. And they will say, well, it's all about that, that thing when Satan came into the garden and, tricked Eve, and then they ate from that fruit that some people mistakenly call an apple, and then there's all this thing, and that's the fallout. In other words, it's not the kid's fault that the kid's dying of cancer. It's Eve's fault, because Eve ate from that fruit, blah, 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 because Satan gave it to her. Of course, if you picked up your little handout and you read Genesis 3, I told you two things were interesting about the reading of those verses from Genesis 3, right? That little handout I gave to you. One was what's said, the other is what's not said. For example, if you go back and take a look at those lines, you will notice that the word Satan never gets used one time in Genesis 3. It's not used. Not once. The word serpent is used. Talking snakes are always fun in mythic stories. We have lots of examples of talking animals, and in this case it's a snake. But it's always interesting to point out what's absent from this Genesis 3 account. Not so much what's there, but what's not there. And there's an example of it, a classic example of it. Okay, well, what do you mean? How do you know it was a snake that was Satan? Where does that come from? The answer is Milton. Milton's going to play the game for us, where he's going to take those few verses from Genesis 3 and he's going to turn them into an amazingly long dare we say it, and complex poem. Okay? So there's 2 projects for Milton. I don't want you to miss this. Okay? Here's the problem with picking up Paradise Lost. Most people pick it up, they go 25 lines into it, they just shut it, and no way. Some of you probably experienced the same, and you said, thank heavens for plot summaries, because I'm just going to get told what this is about. I ain't going to try and read this stuff. I'm going to actually make the argument, no. You want to read this stuff. You want to put yourself through the, dare I say it, pain of reading this material. It's much easier to read this material, though, if you know what you're reading. And that's why I'm making this observation. 2 things. 1, Milton has as his mission, he wants to write the greatest poem ever written. All right? So, for example, ba-bum, 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 ba-bum. Ba-bum, 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 ba-bum. Remember, what do we call that? Iambic pentameter. The entire poem is written in iambic pentameter. For those of you who are struggling to get 14 lines, right? We're talking thousands of lines. He never breaks iambic. Ba-bum, 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 ba-bum. All the way through. The entire poem constructed in iambic. Now, no rhyme scheme, which is why we call this blank verse. Okay, it's iambic, but it's blank. There's no rhyme scheme. Milton is not going to demean his poem by using rhyme. Why? Well, you have to start, as you learned with your sonnet writing, you have to start manipulating the language, and pretty soon you start saying silly things to put them in certain order so you can get a rhyme. Milton's not going to play that game at all. He's not interested in rhyme, but he will write in iambic pentameter just to show you what kind of poet he is. He can write in iambic every single line for thousands and thousands of lines of poetry. Okay, so he's going to do that project. So his objective is to prove just what kind of poet he is. For example, he will reference literally thousands of other texts. For example, if you pick up a copy of Paradise Lost that's been what we call annotated, that is to say scholars have kind of studied the poem and they put little footnotes at the bottom to tell you where all of his references come from. There are whole pages that are nothing more than just the notes for each one of the books. Where, for example, he's quoting from a passage in early Mesopotamian mythology. He's quoting from Homer. He's quoting from Virgil, or he's referencing all of that. Again, if you can have texts memorized that you've read, you have a tendency to want to show off. So at our first point here, let's just say what it is. Milton is intentionally showing off. He's basically saying, you can't do this, and I can. You can't touch this, and I can. All poets to follow Milton, and here we think of T.S. Eliot. All poets to follow Milton will try to play the same game. Our classic example of this is T.S. Eliot, 1922, publishing Wasteland. We'll get to it. And T.S. Eliot will say that nobody can touch Milton, but I at least want to play a similar game. I want to prove how much I know that you don't know. Got me? And Milton isn't talking to laymen on the street. He's talking to the best and brightest minds in all of Europe. He says, I'm going to use references that nobody else knows because nobody else will have read the books. And his wealth of reading is so broad that he can quote from everywhere and everybody. Got me? So he's going to play that game. Along with iambic pentameter, then, he's playing the game of proving his genius. He wants to show off. That's his first mission. He wants you. No kidding. He wants to intimidate you. So for those of you who read the first 25 lines and you went, whoa, 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 what am I reading? Milton's doing one of these from the grave. Done. Another wimp quit reading. That's my point with this. If you want to consider yourself a scholar of any merit, you have to read this, and it ain't going to be easy. Guys, it was not easy for the genius intellect of Milton's days to read this. So for those of you who start picking this up and going, oh. So for example, notice all the different names that all of the different demons are given in Book 1. Well, Milton's proving to you all the different mythologies that he's read where he can use all these different names. He doesn't tell you the difference between all these different demonic names. He assumes, knowing you don't, he assumes that you know the difference between a Mesopotamian and a Phoenician deity. Some of us are like, Phoenician? Mesopotamian? Are you kidding me? Right? So he's playing an intentional game of literary intellectual intimidation that still works today. Still works today. I would say it works better today because fewer and fewer readers even read the fundamental texts. One or two of you maybe had never read Genesis 3 before I gave it to you. Milton's writing to people who have Genesis 3 memorized, the passage that school children memorized. It's at the bedrock of Christian theology, and therefore you memorized it. Some of you had heard the story of Genesis 3, you just never had read it. Some of you didn't read it because you already thought you knew the story, and now that I've mentioned, for example, there's no mention of Satan in those verses, you're going to go back and read it on your own later. Others of you will find experts in the field, people you are around, and you're going to say, wait a minute, what? And you're going to start asking questions. Milton likes that you start asking questions. But he's out to intimidate you, which is why I say you want to read it. I mean really read it. Because if you really read it, you can report for the rest of your life to those who ask, no, I read it. You read that? Yeah, I read it. That is to say, it's kind of like any other challenge. What is it that was said about why he climbed Everest? Because it was there. That is to say, it's a challenge. And Milton is definitely throwing down the gauntlet. He is saying, you thought Shakespeare was tough? Shakespeare is child's play compared to Paradise Lost. And by the way, it is. By the time you're into the second book, you'll realize how much more difficult it is to read Milton than it is to read Shakespeare. Shakespeare is kind of a joke compared to Miltonic language. But that's only the first leg of his two-leg project. And if we miss this, we'll miss really the major agenda for Milton. Milton, because you could argue, well, that's pretty conceited. He's trying to prove he's the best writer of all time by confusing me and all this obfuscation, all that. No, that's only the first step. The second step's more important, and that is his attempt to answer what had become by Milton's day the quintessential theological question, the Theodicy question. My daughter's dying of cancer. You're telling me to believe in God, an all-loving, all-powerful deity. Garbage. It is complete garbage. My kid is dying of leukemia. That is not garbage. That I do know. But the fact that you're telling me there's a God who loves my daughter and can cure her cancer and doesn't, even though he's all-loving, that's garbage. I don't buy it. I don't believe it. I will not believe in a God like that. I don't believe in a theology like that. Christianity goes down the toilet. Done. And it's a simple argument because my kid's going to die of leukemia. Milton says to that, let me give you an answer, but it's going to take reading my poem to get there. Now, there will be a number of us who have heard Milton's answer in summary. Milton's answer in summary is what we will simply call, there's different wording for this, sometimes it's called free choice, sometimes it's called agency, okay? This term, free choice or agency or free will it's sometimes called, is Milton's invention. All right? If you go, for example, to the King James 1611 Bible, and you do a Google search, for example, or you do a Bible search or a word search for the term free will, you won't find it. Or the term agency, you won't find it. It doesn't exist. It is a created notion, and it's created in large measure by Milton. Not just Milton, of course, others like St. Augustine had a role to play. Milton gives us the classic answer to this question. How does he do it? Well, he begins with the story. It's the story of Genesis 3. He takes this, what we call the Eden myth. He takes the Eden story and he's going to amplify it. How does he set it up? Well, he knows he's writing an epic poem. And because he knows he's writing an epic poem, he has to do what all the great epic poems will do. That is to say, the invocation and the muse and the like. Let's start now with Paradise Lost, Book 1, lines 1 through 25. These are, of course, the most famous lines of the poem because, quite frankly, they're the lines that most everybody reads and then says, "Where's the plot summary on this one again? You know, what happens in this? I gotta read some Spark Notes or whatever." Hey, I've been lecturing this poem for many, many years. I am not at all blind to the fact that you are busy people and probably reading every line of this poem is not in your immediate future, nor your interest. But what I would say is the following. Reading a few lines of Milton is a great experience in pain. And I mean that, intellectual pain. It is a challenge. But the other thing I will say is that with help of a summary, you can begin to read this and start to figure it out. And with that, figure it out, comes a certain kind of academic intellectual confidence. Another way to say this is, you can read anything at university if you can read this. And I really believe that. I mean, this is about as difficult or as challenging as you can read. Let's take a look, though, at the opening lines of this poem and see just how well we do. Of man's first disobedience and the fruit of that forbidden tree, whose mortal taste brought death into the world and all our woe. With loss of Eden, till one greater man restore us and regain the blissful seat. Sing, heavenly muse, that on the secret top of Oreb or of Sinai didst inspire that shepherd who first taught the chosen seed in the beginning how the heavens and the earth rose out of chaos. Or, if Sinon hill delight thee more, and Shiloh's brook that flowed fast by the oracle of God, I thence invoke thy aid to my adventurous song, that with no middle flight intends to soar above the Ionian mount, while it pursues things unattempted yet in prose or rhyme. And chiefly thou, O Spirit, that dost prefer before all temples the upright heart and pure, instruct me. For thou knowest, thou from the first wast present, and with mighty wings outspread, dove-like, satst brooding on the vast abyss, and mates did pregnant. What in me is dark, illume. What is low, raise and support. That to the height of this great argument, I may assert eternal providence and justify the ways of God to men. Now I'll begin where I just ended. Justify the ways of God to men. Are you ready for this? Is Theodicy. Got me? So when you read the line, justify the ways of God to men, just insert there the idea of the theodicic enterprise. In other words, I'm going to explain to the mother, standing beside the bed with a 5-year-old dying of leukemia, why the child must die. Whoa, for reals. Yes, that's right. Milton says it right away. That's why I'm writing this poem. That's right. That's why I'm writing this poem. Of course, if you'll think about it, and this is what makes Milton so enduring, of all the things that happen in this world, probably the most notorious is the evil and the suffering of the world. Would you agree? I mean, everybody's going to experience that, right? Not everybody gets to experience what it's like to be a billionaire, but everybody gets to experience what it's like to have suffering in his or her life. That is not of his or her own creation. Would you agree with me? You don't make that up. You don't make that pain up. It just happens to you. The obvious question is, why is this happening to me? And in that moment, you've asked the theodicic question. And Milton says, I got an answer for you. Milton takes one step further and will say, I've got the knockdown answer. Are you ready for this? Milton genuinely believes there's no argument against this answer. He really does. He really does believe this. He believes this is a knockdown answer that cannot be argued against. But to get there, of course, you're going to have to read the poem, right? Let's go back now and take a look at where he starts. Notice where he begins. He begins at Genesis 3, of man's first disobedience. Humans, of course, are humans that disobey all the time, but there is a single moment in the history of humanity for Milton when humans disobeyed, and that will, of course, be the Eden story of Genesis 3. And it's not just disobedience, it's the fruit. Of course, it's not referred to as an apple at all, is it, right? It's the fruit of that forbidden tree. Remember, we have the story in the Eden motif, the story in which you have all of the trees in the garden allowed to be eaten from, but one tree you're not allowed to be eaten from is the tree of what? What's called in the Genesis 3 account? The tree of knowledge. The tree of knowledge. That is to say, knowledge of what? Both good as well as evil. You're not allowed to eat from that tree. Why not? What is it that's said? In the moment that you eat from that tree, what will happen? For those of you who read from the Genesis 3 story, what's it say? You're going to die. Yeah, the moment that you eat from this tree, you're jacked. You're bummed. You don't get to live anymore. You're the child dying of leukemia. You're going to die. Right? Okay. So disobedience means right away, notice, Adam and Eve had a choice. Eat from the tree, don't eat from the tree. They choose to eat from the tree, the forbidden tree, whose mortal taste brought death into the world. Look, we're 3 lines into Paradise Lost, and Milton's already given his theodicy, at least in broad strokes. To the mother, for example, who has a child dying of leukemia. Yeah, it's sad. Yeah, it's really sad. Don't blame God, blame sin. It's right here. It's the second word in the first line. Who are you going to blame? It's Adam's fault. It's Eve's fault. That first man. You can't blame God. You got to, right? For those of you who have ever heard this argument, well, you can't blame God. You got to, humans have to be given free will or free choice or agency to be able to decide whether they're going to follow or not. That's pure Milton. And that's Milton's theology, okay? And it's his Theodicy as well. Notice it brought death into the world. Not just death, but what else? What else? All our woe, all our pain, all our suffering. So in other words, it's not just death, it's anything else. That's why I put the word evil up there. A lot of people will put the word suffering, that one, because the word evil is kind of like, a little bit obscure as to exactly what it means. Suffering, basically, right? Bad things, if you will. With loss of Eden. What's that all about? See, here's the thing. We already know the end trajectory. It's like going to the film Titanic. You're going to watch 3 hours to figure out the boat sinks. You already knew that. You're going to read this entire poem. I know there's more than that, so I'm too sure. You're going to read this entire poem, but you already know how it ends. How does it end for poor Adam and poor Eve? What happens to them? They do. They get bunged. They get thrown out of this beautiful Garden of Eden that later will, of course, be qualified as paradise. Notice the word not used in the Genesis 3 account to qualify this area as paradise, or this perfect place. Wait a minute, what's the title of our poem? Paradise Lost. I remember giving this lecture, and all of a sudden from the back of the room a student went, now I get it. So Paradise Lost was what happened to Adam and Eve because they had to leave paradise. Right, and this is it right here. Notice the loss of Eden. Notice the loss of Eden, not just for who? This loss of Eden doesn't just happen for Adam and Eve. It happens for who else? It happens for all of us, right? Humans are forever trying to get back to Eden or to El Dorado or any other word that you want to use that comprises the notion of panacea, utopia, perfection, Eden, right? The idea of getting back. Never going to happen. Why isn't it ever going to happen? Why can't we have a perfect world? Don't blame it on the deity, Milton will say. Blame it on of man's first disobedience. And all our woe with loss of Eden till, and that's an important phrase in Christian theology, remember Milton's a Christian, till one greater man restore us. Who's he talking about? Jesus. This will be Christ, of course. This is the argument of Christian theology. And regain the blissful seat. The idea is, yes, humans are fallen. By the way, the word not used in Genesis 3. Did you notice that? The word fall not used. The word sin not used in Genesis 3. Isn't that fascinating? Okay? But here, Milton will reference it as the fall, right? And that is to say to be restored back to the blissful seat. Now to the invocation of the muse. Sing, heavenly muse, that on the secret top of Oreb or of Sinai didst inspire that shepherd. What shepherd? No? Moses. Yeah, it is Moses. Moses is the one supposedly responsible for the first 5 books of the Bible called the what? Does anyone know from earlier study? We call the first 5 books of the Bible the Pentateuch. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Those books are ascribed to, supposedly, Moses, who started out as a what? Do you know? Didn't start out as a shepherd. What did he start out as? He started out as a prince in Egypt, remember? Moses is an interesting cat. That's an interesting story. Who else have we read that really liked Moses a lot? Now I'm asking to see who read. Who said about Moses that he was one of the greatest leaders of all time? Machiavelli. Moses starts out a big shot, right? A prince in Egypt, and then he ends up having to leave Egypt, go out into the wilderness where he ends up a shepherd. Of course, he has a conversion experience, and in the process, he becomes the major leader of the Hebrew people out of exile, right, out of bondage and into exile, all of that. So here's the invocation of the muse. Notice in the beginning how the heavens and the earth rose out of chaos, that is to say the Genesis 1 story. Or if Sinon hill delight thee more, and Shiloh's brook that flowed fast by the oracle of God. These are geographic locations that are biblical. You can read your sidebar. I thence invoke thy aid to, look what he calls his poem. See, I've often said this to students. You've spent most of your intellectual life running away from challenges because you saw it as work. Milton says, don't think of my poem as work. Think of it as an adventurous song. It's an adventure. It's going to be hard. It's going to be a challenge. but all great stories that really challenge you are adventures. And he'll call it an adventurous song. Later he'll call it an argument. That with no middle flight intends, look what he says his poem intends to do. Intends to soar above the Ionian Mount, while it pursues things, here it is, talk about conceit, unattempted yet in prose and rhyme. I'm going to write a poem that's never been written before. I'm going to write something that's never been attempted either in prose or in rhyme, poetry. I'm going to write what's never been written. Now this is a little bit blasphemous because he's telling a story that's already been written, namely what? Genesis 3, right? We already know this story, and yet he says, I'm really going to tell the story. I'm going to tell you the rest of the story. I'm going to fill in the holes, right? And in the process of filling in the holes, he's going to create one of the greatest poems of all time. Notice he says, and chiefly thou spirit that dost prefer all temples, the upright heart and pure, instruct me, for thou knowest thou from the first was present, and with mighty wings outspread, dove-like sets, brooding on the vast abyss. Will obviously reference as well Satan later. And mates did pregnant. Look what he says. What in me is dark, illumined. Why would he say that? He's blind. You got it. Yeah. Thanks, guys. Come back tomorrow, and we'll do a little bit more.